the time to begin H-1B cap planning. Welcome to Live at Lunch with Emily Sumner of Sumner Immigration Law. We are talking today about the process of planning for the H-1B cap. So what does that mean? What am I talking about? The H-1B, of course, is a temporary visa classification for professionals, generally meaning positions that require a minimum of a bachelor's degree in a specific field of study. The cap portion refers to the fact that there's a limited number of H-1Bs available every year. Certainly, the H-1B is not the only type of visa classification that allows a person to work in the United States, but it's very popular. Because it's so popular, because it is pretty versatile, a lot of people want a new H-1B every year. There's a limit on the number of new H-1Bs available every year for cap subject employers, which is the majority of employers. That limit is 65,000 plus an additional 20,000 for US master's degree holders. So there are so many people who want this H-1B and there's a cap. So there's a lottery. That's the result of the two of these. There's a lottery. The registration period for the lottery begins in March of every year. So you may be thinking, Emily, the leaves are just starting to fall if you are in a place that has the fall season. What is going on? This is 6 months away, more than 6 months away. Why are we talking about this right now? Because we have time. We find that in immigration law, planning ahead is really, really helpful. Having conversations ahead of time is helpful. It reduces stress. It increases communication. It's so helpful for both employees and employers to have a plan in place ahead of time as much as possible. And that's not always possible, and that's okay. We can certainly assist clients who have last minute needs pop up. But if you know that you are potentially going to be in this situation, now is the time to at least start thinking about this. So let's talk about what that means. If you are an employer and you have foreign national employees who are working with you in different immigration statuses. So for example, look at your employee base. And if you have foreign national employees who are working on OPT, which is optional practical training, STEM OPT, which is an extension of that initial 12 months of OPT. If you have employees who are working on CPT, which is curricular practical training, or perhaps if you have employees working in other visa classifications, like on an H-4 EAD, an L-2 EAD. And when I say EAD, I mean employment authorization document. If you have foreign national employees, you may want to consider asking them if they anticipate needing sponsorship for the H-1B. Now, it's important you understand what that means. We have a series of videos on the H-1B, what the H-1B requirements are, what the cap process is, what the requirements for the H-1B are. So you want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of what that is and that you're actually able to sponsor a person, but you can at least start that conversation and start developing a policy if you don't already have one in place to determine if you are able and willing to sponsor individuals for H-1B. Then, like I said, have that conversation with employees who may be eligible, may be interested sooner rather than later. So things that you need to think about as an employer, like I said, are, do you have an immigration sponsorship policy in place? It does not have to be formal, but it is good to have an idea of, yes, we're able to put this into the budget. We're able to dedicate the resources and time that will be needed for this. Sometimes employers will have certain positions that they sponsor versus others that they don't sponsor for various reasons. And if you have questions about that, about developing an immigration policy, I love that kind of thing, and I'm here to help. But think about an immigration policy, consider the budget. The budget, so the legal fees vary, of course, depending on the immigration attorney that you're working with. The filing fees will vary as well. The filing fee structure became quite complicated as of last April. But again, we're happy to help you work through those calculations as well. One thing to keep in mind, the registration fee. So to register an employee for the H-1B cap, that's the registration that happens in March, is going up from $10 to $215. So that's something to keep in mind as you prepare budgets. I know going into fourth quarter here, a lot of people are working on budgets for 2025 and beyond possibly, but anyway, for 2025. So keep that in mind, that the registration fee is changing from $10 to $215. Then there is, if you are working with an immigration attorney to register employees, there's the fee that they charge. And then if your employees are selected in the H-1B cap and you file an H-1B petition for them, you'll have the legal fees and the USCIS filing fees in addition. In general, the employer has to pay those fees. They cannot, by regulation in general, with very narrow exceptions that have an element of risk to them, they are not, the employees are not permitted to pay those fees. So budgeting, sponsorship process, looking at whether the potential employees or positions that you want to sponsor are positions that would even be H-1B eligible. So remember that for an H-1B petition, the position has to be one that requires a minimum of a bachelor's degree in a specific field of study, and the employee has to have that as well. Another thing to possibly keep in mind as an employer is openings that you have in your company. If you have a position that is open that perhaps is hard to recruit for, hard to fill, you may consider opening the doors to H-1B sponsorship for that. It could be that it's filled sooner rather than later with perhaps an H-1B transfer, meaning somebody who already holds H-1B status. They are not subject to the H-1B cap and to this lottery process that I'm talking about. But I know there are certain professions that are just hard to recruit for, or maybe different positions, or maybe it depends on your geographic area. And opening the door to H-1B sponsorship could potentially solve that problem. So that's another thing to be aware of, and perhaps open your recruitment wider to include foreign nationals who may not already be work authorized in the United States. If you are an individual employee or an international student in the United States, and you're graduating soon, this is also a great time to start thinking about the H-1B. And this applies to employers as well. It can be a really difficult conversation for foreign national employees to have, because it's hard enough to find a job, and then you don't necessarily want to also ask the employer to sponsor you. So I know it's easy to kind of kick that conversation down the road and say, oh, I'll deal with it closer to the time. This is not legal advice. It's not even personal or professional advice, but something to keep in mind is a lot of times having that conversation, or at least initiating that conversation sooner rather than later, actually can be really helpful for both parties, both for the foreign national individual and for the company as well. Because like I said, there is an element of budget planning, resource planning, planning what your long-term or even medium-term immigration status is going to be. So for example, if you are on OPT right now, let's say that you are an F1 student working on OPT, or you will be working on OPT come after let's say summer of 2025. You have to make sure that you meet the H-1B requirements. In other words, the degree has to be earned, at least as of the time that you file the H-1B petition. So make sure that you're aware of that type of requirement. But my point is, because of the H-1B lottery, a lot of times a person is not selected the first go round. The statistics or the chance of being selected in the lottery, of course, depends on how many people actually register. But in years past, like this past year, the selection rate was roughly 25%. About 1 in 4 were selected in the H-1B lottery. So statistically, the more times that you register in a lottery, and I don't know if that's true statistically, but my point is that you may have to register in the lottery more than once. So just because you know that you can get STEM OPT, don't necessarily discount the idea of filing for the H-1B lottery during your initial 12-month OPT period. I've had lots of situations where clients actually do that. They file during the first chance that they have available, the first 12 months of OPT that they have, knowing that they have the STEM OPT. You can still use the STEM OPT. You don't have to give that up, because once you give that up, you can't get it back. So you actually can still use that STEM OPT, but just select the option for consular processing. That's a whole nother strategy that we can get into later. But no, if you are a student, or if you have an employee or potential employee who will have the 12 months of OPT and you know that they'll have the STEM OPT, I still would recommend at least thinking about considering the possibility of registering in the H-1B lottery every year that you have the chance to do so, instead of just waiting until a year, 2 or 3 to do it, because it's absolutely not guaranteed that you will be selected the first go round. So that's something to keep in mind. Also keep in mind that the earlier you start this kind of planning process, the better of a chance, more time you have to come up with a plan. So if there is a gap between, let's say, the end of your OPT or your STEM OPT and the beginning of your H-1B, the more time you have to plan, the better. In general, for situations like that, something like H-1B cap gap is going, or not something like H-1B cap gap will potentially apply in that situation. But every year we have situations where there are potential gaps in work authorization, depending on the situation. So the sooner you have that conversation with your employer or potential employer, the more time you have to coordinate with the employer, with your own plans, and an immigration attorney to come up with a medium-term plan to potentially make it so that you are not without work authorization at a certain point. So the takeaway here is that yes, the H-1B registration period is 6 months away, but the time to start planning and having these conversations is now in September. There's not a big rush. It's not anything urgent. I'm not ringing alarm bells here, but this is an awesome time to begin because, like I said, companies are establishing their 2025 budgets as they go into Q4 here and planning for resources and just making plans in general. So this is a really great time to start. In terms of timing, let's say that you have this conversation, whether you are an employer or an employee, you have this conversation, you know that you do plan to register your employee or be registered in the H-1B lottery. Then in terms of timing, our office tends to begin, we'll have a webinar probably in November about this process. So be on the lookout for signups for that if you're interested. But as far as like gathering information and actually initiating the process, we typically do that in the new year. So January of 2025 is when we will begin doing that all through February. And then typically the registration period is in March, typically for a period of about 3 weeks, 2.5 to 3 weeks in March. Then the H-1B lottery is run at the end of March. So at the end of March of 2025, you should know if you're selected in the H-1B lottery, at least for the first round. Then you can file the H-1B petition starting April 1st through June 30th. The H-1B status itself does not become effective, cannot become effective until October 1st. So right now, it's currently September 17th. We are about, in a few weeks, it'll be October 1st. And that's when the H-1B status for people that we filed for earlier this year will become effective, assuming their petitions are already approved. So something to keep in mind in terms of timing is you register in March, you find out the end of March if you're selected, you file between April and June, and then the status becomes effective in October, assuming the petition is approved by then. It is possible that there would be a second round of the H-1B lottery. That did happen this year, and it did happen in 2023 as well. I was a little surprised, pleasantly surprised that it happened this year. It just depends on how many people actually file petitions, H-1B petitions, and if USCIS doesn't have, quote, enough people that filed H-1B petitions, then they will do a second round. So we are finishing up right now filing those petitions that were selected in July, late July, for the second round. And same thing, their H-1B status can become effective October 1st, assuming their petition is approved by then. If not, whenever their petition is approved, or if they selected consular processing, that's another story, and it will become effective when they re-enter the United States. So I hope that this information is helpful. If it is helpful, please share this video with a friend or a colleague. Make sure that you subscribe to the platform that you are watching this on so you don't miss our next Live at Lunch. My name is Emily Sumner with Sumner Immigration Law. We help clients with family-based and employment-based immigration matters all around the world and, of course, throughout the United States as well. Until next time.